The rain fell in a thin, determined sheet against the window of Lena's small apartment, blurring the already gray Chicago skyline into a watercolor wash of concrete and steel. It was a sound she had come to associate with solitude, a persistent whisper that filled the spaces where conversation used to be. On her drafting table, under the clean white light of an architect's lamp, lay the invitation. It was cream-colored, thick as a credit card. The calligraphy and ostentatious swirl of gold ink, an invitation to the rest of Marcus's life, a life he was building on the rubble of theirs. She traced the embossed edges with a fingertip, the paper cool and impersonal against her skin. It had been 2 years since the divorce, 2 years of scraping by, of rebuilding a career he had convinced her to abandon, of learning to sleep in the middle of the bed again. The exhaustion was bone deep, a permanent resident in her marrow. She worked as a freelance art authenticator and restorer, a quiet, meticulous job that suited her. It was a life of careful lines and patient work, of bringing faded things back to vibrancy, a life that made the gilded invitation feel like a page torn from someone else's story. Her phone buzzed, a sharp, intrusive sound in the quiet room. She ignored it. It would be him, not Marcus, never Marcus anymore. It would be Victor, a man who existed in a world so far removed from this rainy afternoon that the thought felt like a tectonic shift. A man who had found her when she was nothing but dust and shadow. She remembered the first time she saw him in a sterile, white-walled gallery where she had been summoned to assess a newly acquired icon from the Novgorod school. He hadn't introduced himself. He simply stood there, a figure of impossible stillness in a bespoke suit the color of a midnight sky. He didn't look at the art. He looked at her. He watched the way her hands, steady and sure, moved over the ancient, gessoed wood panel, the way her focus narrowed until the rest of the world ceased to exist. He was a client, a wealthy, enigmatic collector. That was all she allowed herself to think, but the silence in the room had a weight to it, a pressure that had nothing to do with the priceless artifact between them. He had asked her a single question, his voice a low, resonant timbre. "What do you see?" She hadn't looked up. "I see a ghost," she'd replied, her eyes on the faint underdrawing of a long-dead monk. A story someone tried to erase. A long silence had followed, and in it she had felt his assessment, a gaze as precise and penetrating as her own. He offered her a job the next day, a full-time position as the curator of his private collection. The salary was obscene, enough to erase the mountain of debt Marcus had left her with, enough to buy a dozen apartments like the one she was currently renting. She knew she should have refused. There were whispers about him, shadows that clung to his name in the high-end art world, murmurs of old money and new, ruthless business. The term bratva was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air like cigar smoke. A powerful, dangerous man, a Russian mob boss. But desperation was a powerful motivator, and his offer was a lifeline she was too tired to refuse. She accepted, telling herself it was a professional arrangement, a transaction. She would be his curator, and he would be her employer. She built walls around the engagement, lines of professional conduct he never once tried to cross. He was unfailingly polite, his demeanor a mask of cool, impenetrable control. He would watch her work, sometimes for hours, without saying a word. His stillness was his defining characteristic. It wasn't passive, it was predatory, the stillness of a wolf watching its prey, calculating, waiting. Yet when he spoke, his questions were always about the art, about its history, its soul. He was a man who understood the value of beauty and the violence it often took to possess it. She saw it in his collection. Serene landscapes by Levitan hanging next to depictions of ancient, bloody Cossack battles. He was a man of contradictions. The first crack in her professional armor came not from him, but from his children, twin girls, Anya and Katya, 10 years old. With their father's serious eyes and silent way of moving, they would appear in the gallery of his penthouse, two small ghosts in matching dresses, watching her restore a cracked ceramic vase or revarnish a fraying canvas. They never spoke, not at first. They just watched. One day she had looked up and found them standing a few feet away. "It's broken," Katya had said, her voice a small, clear bell. "Yes," Lena had replied, not missing a beat in her work. "But it doesn't have to stay that way." She offered them a piece of dried apricot from her snack bag. They took it with a shared, solemn glance at each other, then at her, a silent question in their eyes, a question about whether she was temporary, like so many others. From his study, Victor watched them on the security monitor. He watched this woman, this stranger, dismantle the fortress he had built around his daughter's hearts, with a piece of dried fruit and a simple truth. He had hired her for her skill, for the quiet competence that seemed to radiate from her like a low hum. He had been intrigued by her lack of fear, the way she met his gaze directly without the fawning or the terror he was accustomed to. She treated him like a man, not a monster, just a client. But watching her with his children stirred something else within him, a feeling he had long since buried, a dangerous, unfamiliar warmth. She didn't coddle them. She spoke to them as if they were intelligent beings, explaining the chemical composition of a pigment she was mixing, the history of the Cossack sabers she was polishing, and they in turn began to open up to her, their silence blossoming into cautious questions, then into laughter that echoed in the sterile halls of his home. He had built this empire of glass and steel and fear to protect them, to keep the world at bay. Yet this woman, with her tired eyes and gentle hands, had walked right through the gates without even seeming to notice they were there. He was a man who controlled everything: his business, his emotions, the very air in a room. But he could not control the slow, inexorable way Lena was embedding herself into the foundations of his life. He found himself manufacturing reasons to be near her, bringing her tea he brewed himself, asking her opinion on acquisitions he had no intention of making. Each interaction was a carefully calculated risk. He analyzed her responses, her body language, the slight upturn of her lips that she probably thought was a secret. He was a man who understood leverage, who knew that all attachments were vulnerabilities. And Lena, he was beginning to realize, was the most profound vulnerability he had ever encountered. The thought did not frighten him, it terrified him, because for the first time in his life, it was a risk he was willing to take. He saw the invitation on her desk one evening when he brought her a file. He recognized the name on the return address: Marcus, the fool who had let her go. He watched her face, the flicker of old pain she tried to hide. He said nothing, merely placed the file down, his movements deliberate. Control. Always control. The professional arrangement began to fray at the edges slowly, then all at once. It happened on a Tuesday. Lena was cataloging a new shipment of scrolls in the climate-controlled storage room in the sub-basement of his building, a concrete bunker that was more secure than most banks. The twins were with her, chattering about a school project, their laughter a bright, incongruous sound in the quiet vault. Lena was smiling, a genuine, unguarded expression that made something in Victor's chest ache. He was watching, as he always was, from the monitor in his office 3 floors above. Then the lights went out. The monitors flickered to black, and the silent alarm, a pulsing red light on his console, began to flash. It was a complete systems failure, a clean severance from the city grid. It wasn't an accident. He was on his feet in an instant, his body moving with an economy of motion that was brutally efficient. The calm facade dropped, replaced by the cold, lethal precision of the man he truly was. He spoke quietly into his wrist communicator, Russian words snapping like ice. His security team was already in motion, but his only thought was of the 3 people in the basement, of her. He was at the vault door in under a minute. It was sealed, the electronic lock dead. His men were there, armed, their faces grim. "Blow it," he commanded, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The explosion was a dull thud that vibrated through the concrete floor. Through the smoke, he saw them. Lena was crouched on the floor, her body shielding Anya and Katya, who were clinging to her, their faces buried in her coat. She was speaking to them in a low, soothing voice, her own fear a palpable thing but secondary to their need for comfort. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide in the emergency lighting. But there was no panic in them, only a fierce, protective fire. He saw in that moment that she was not a vulnerability. She was a fortress, and she was protecting what was his. The threat was neutralized quickly. A rival Grupirovka making a foolish play for power. But the aftermath lingered. The violence of his world had finally breached the walls of their quiet arrangement. Later that night, after his men had cleaned up the mess, and the building had returned to its state of high-tech, humming security. He found her in the gallery. She was standing before a painting of a single resilient birch tree blooming in the snow. She didn't turn when he approached. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the scent of cordite and the raw, metallic tang of fear. He expected her to resign. He expected her to run. It was the sensible thing to do. He had the envelope with her severance, a sum large enough for her to disappear and start a new life anywhere in the world, ready in his pocket. A clean break, a necessary amputation before the infection could spread. He stopped a few feet behind her, the silence stretching, pulling taut. "They tried to use you as leverage," he said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, a confession of the danger his presence brought into her life. "I know," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. She wasn't looking at him with fear, but with a startling clarity, as if the day's events had burned away all pretense. "Are the girls okay?" she asked. It was the first thing she said. Not about herself, not about the danger, but about his children. "They are sleeping," he replied, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. He watched her, this woman who had faced down the violent reality of his existence and whose first concern was for his family. The control he prized, the iron discipline that had kept him alive, was sand slipping through his fingers. He had prepared for her to leave. He had not prepared for her to stay. He had spent his life building walls, and she was dismantling them brick by brick without even trying. The worst part, the most terrifying part, was that he was letting her. He found he wanted her to. He wanted to see what was on the other side. "You should go, Lena," he said, the words costing him more than he could have imagined. "This world, it is not for you." She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "And what if I don't want to go?" she asked, her gaze holding his. "What if I finally found something worth staying for?" The wedding invitation remained on her table, a pale rectangle of judgment in the dim light. After the attack, everything had changed. The unspoken became spoken. The carefully constructed distance between them collapsed. Victor was no longer just her employer. He was the man who came to her apartment when the nightmares came, who sat in the dark with her until the shaking stopped. He was the man who had his daughters help him cook her favorite meal, a clumsy, heartfelt gesture of gratitude that left her breathless. He was a mob boss, a killer, a man who moved through a world of shadows and blood. But he was also just Victor, the man who looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world of ghosts. One evening, he saw her staring at the invitation. He came and stood behind her, his presence a familiar weight, a source of comfort that still felt illicit. "He is the man who broke you," Victor stated, his voice a low murmur against her hair. It wasn't a question. He tried, she corrected softly. He didn't succeed. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch gentle, a stark contrast to the power she knew he wielded. "Do you wish to go?" he asked. She looked at their reflection in the dark window. Her, weary but standing. Him, a pillar of darkness behind her, his face unreadable, but his hands on her a clear declaration. Going to that wedding felt like facing a ghost. A part of her she had tried to bury, but maybe she didn't have to bury it. Maybe she just had to walk past it. "I don't know," she whispered, the admission costing her. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to see him happy." Victor was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You will not go alone." The decision was made. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about showing Marcus what he had lost. It was about closing a door, firmly, and finally. It was about showing herself that the woman who had been left with nothing was gone, and the woman who stood in her place was not afraid of ghosts anymore. The preparations were quiet and efficient. Victor handled everything. A white jet, a car, security. He did not ask her what she wanted to wear. He simply had a designer he kept on retainer create a dress for her, a deep emerald green silk that felt like water against her skin. It was a queen's armor. When she saw herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The exhaustion was still there, but it was banked like embers under a layer of ash. In its place was a calm, steady strength she hadn't known she possessed. The morning of the wedding, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the day the invitation had arrived. Anya and Katya appeared at her door, dressed in identical, elegant gray dresses, their hair tied back with black ribbons. They each took one of her hands, their small fingers lacing through hers. They didn't say anything, but their presence was a statement. "We are with you." Victor was waiting for them at the bottom of the stairs. He was in a perfectly tailored black suit, a shadow brought to life. He looked at her, at his daughters holding her hands, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the impassive Bratva slipped. A flicker of profound, unguarded emotion crossed his face. It was a look of possession, of pride, of something so fiercely protective it was almost violent. He held out his hand. She took it. His grip was warm and firm. "It is time," he said. The flight was smooth, a silent glide through the upper atmosphere. Below them, the world was a map of insignificance. Lena looked out the window, her past shrinking with the distance. She thought of Marcus, of the small, cramped life they had shared, the dreams he had encouraged her to sacrifice for his own. He had wanted a wife who was an accessory, a quiet support system that made no demands. He had not known what to do with the fire in her. Victor had not been afraid of her fire. He had been drawn to it. He had nurtured it, protected it, and now he was taking her to walk through the ashes of her old life. Not to gloat, but to prove that she had risen from them. As the jet began its descent, banking over the manicured green of the countryside estate where the wedding was being held, Lena felt a sense of calm settle over her. This was not an ending. It was a beginning, the final, quiet click of a door she was closing herself, with her own hand. Beside her, Victor watched her face, his expression unreadable. He had orchestrated this entire display of power for one reason, to give her back a piece of what had been stolen from her. Not her pride, she had never lost that, but her peace. He was a man who dealt in violence and fear. But with her, he only wanted to build a sanctuary. The sound of the jet was the first intrusion, a low, powerful hum that grew into a roar, drowning out the string quartet playing Vivaldi on the lawn. Heads turned, champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Marcus looked up, shielding his eyes, a frown creasing his handsome face. He saw the sleek white aircraft, a machine of impossible wealth and power, as it settled onto a distant private landing strip on the estate grounds. He didn't understand. None of his guests were arriving by private jet. His bride, Tiffany, appeared at his side, her white dress a meringue of belligerent lace. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice sharp with irritation. Who would be so tacky as to upstage the bride? Marcus had no answer. He had sent the invitation to Lena as a final twist of the knife, a boastful display of everything he had accomplished since he left her. He had imagined her receiving it in her sad little apartment, a bitter reminder of her failure. He expected her to ignore it. At most, he thought she might show up alone, looking worn and tired, a ghost at the feast. He never expected this. A black armored car detached itself from the shadow of the jet and began to move slowly, deliberately up the long gravel driveway. It was a funereal procession, and every guest turned to watch its silent, menacing approach. The car stopped at the edge of the manicured lawn. The string quartet had fallen silent. The only sound was the crunch of gravel and the nervous murmur of the crowd. A chauffeur in a black uniform opened the rear passenger door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a single, elegant leg and a dark green heel emerged. Lena stepped out of the car. The sun caught the silk of her dress, making it gleam like a jewel. She was not the woman Marcus remembered. The weary, defeated person he had discarded was gone. This woman was regal, composed, her beauty so profound it seemed to silence the very air around her. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, cool and appraising. She looked directly at him, and he felt a jolt, a phantom limb aching where she had been cut away. Then two small girls in matching gray dresses got out, flanking her, each taking one of her hands. They were beautiful, solemn children, who stood with an unnerving stillness. And then he emerged. Victor unfolded himself from the car, a figure of such intense, controlled power that a collective gasp went through the crowd. He was not handsome in the way Marcus was. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his eyes holding a depth that felt ancient and dangerous. He moved to Lena's side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. A gesture of ownership so absolute it was breathtaking. He surveyed the scene with a look of utter disinterest, as if he were observing insects. His gaze fell on Marcus, And for a single, terrifying second, Marcus felt the full weight of the man's identity settle on him. This was not a businessman. This was a predator. This was a king in his domain. And this wedding reception was his conquered territory. Tiffany gripped Marcus's arm, her knuckles white. "Who are they?" she hissed, her arrogance curdling into fear. Marcus couldn't speak. He could only watch as Lena, flanked by her new, terrifying family, began to walk towards them. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her expression serene. She was not here to cause a scene. She was not here for revenge. She was here to be seen. To show him the woman she had become, not in spite of him, but in his absence. She was a masterpiece he had been too blind to see, and now she was in the collection of a man who understood her true value. They stopped before him. Lena's eyes, clear and calm, met his. There was no anger in them, no pain. There was nothing. He had become insignificant. A footnote in her story. "Marcus," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Thank you for the invitation. I wouldn't have missed it." Victor's hand never left her back. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His presence was a declaration, a threat, a promise. He looked from Marcus to Tiffany, his gaze lingering on the bride's panicked face for a moment too long, a silent dismissal. He had seen her, assessed her, and found her wanting. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The guests stared, frozen in a tableau of shock and fascination. This was not a wedding anymore. It was a coronation. Lena turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing the lapel of Victor's suit. "I think we've seen enough," she said, her voice for his ears only. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Without another word, they turned and began to walk away, the two girls moving in perfect sync with them. They didn't look back. They walked through the stunned crowd, a silent, powerful unit, and got back into the waiting car. The door closed with a solid, final thud. Marcus was left standing on the lawn, his new bride trembling beside him, the taste of ash in his mouth. He had wanted to show Lena what she had lost, but as the black car disappeared down the driveway and the white jet prepared to reclaim the sky, he was the one who understood loss. He had thrown away a diamond because he couldn't be bothered to wipe the dust off. He had not just lost a wife, he had lost an entire world. Inside the jet as it climbed back into the endless blue, Lena finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned her head against the cool leather of the seat. Anya and Katya had already curled up together, falling asleep in the quiet hum of the engines. Victor took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she whispered. The ghost was gone. The past was finally where it belonged. She looked at this man beside her. This impossible, dangerous man who had shown her what it meant to be truly valued. To be protected not from the world, but for the world to see. Their future was uncertain. A path paved with shadows she couldn't yet comprehend. But for the first time in a long time, she was not afraid of the dark. She was not walking into it alone. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, a silent promise, a commitment made not with vows and rings in front of a crowd, but here, thousands of feet above the earth, with the whole world laid out beneath them. It was a fragile hope, but it was theirs. And it was more than enough.